In the summer of 1877, the ocean was a restless silver mirror under the sun, waves stretching toward the horizon with a rhythmic insistence. Sailors in the Atlantic whispered of strange phenomena, vessels lost, islands appearing where none were charted, and faint music drifting across the waves at night, haunting and melodic. One such island emerged suddenly from the mist, its shores lined with white sand and thick jungle foliage that gleamed like emerald under the harsh midday sun. It had no name on any map, no mention in the journals of explorers, yet travelers swore it existed. Some called it the Hidden Eden. Others spoke of it as a phantom, appearing only to those deemed worthy or foolish enough to approach. The rumor that reached the capitals of Europe was irresistible. A wealthy, mysterious society on the island was hosting a grand banquet. Invitations had been sent carefully, selectively to prominent figures in commerce, nobility and the adventurous elite. The invitations were embossed with gold filigree and sealed with a wax emblem, depicting a ship riding a wave, a symbol no one recognized. Each recipient received instructions to travel without delay, boarding ships that would deliver them directly to the island, escorted by guides who refused to reveal more than the barest details. The language of the invitation was intoxicating. Come and witness a feast of marvels and wonders unseen by civilized eyes. Dine among those who live beyond the horizon, and taste what few have ever imagined. Among the first group to respond was a collection of curious men and women from England, France, and a few scattered colonies. Lord Henry Blackwood, a merchant known for his fascination with exotic foods and far-off lands, packed fine garments in his best silverware. Madame Claudine Dupont, a widow with a taste for adventure and a reputation for scandalous bravery, prepared herself with an elaborate gown of deep crimson silk, its folds glinting in the sunlight. Captain Elias Thorne, a retired naval officer with a lifetime at sea, boarded with a journal in hand, eager to record every unusual occurrence. Together they formed a small flotilla, the ships gleaming with polished wood and brass fittings, cutting through the waves like knives through velvet. The journey itself was as unnerving as it was beautiful. Days at sea passed with a dreamlike quality. The island remained on the horizon, shimmering in the heat haze, appearing closer and further depending on the time of day. Birds of unfamiliar species circled above, their calls eerie, and phosphorescent fish leapt in the ship's wake at night, glowing like embers in the dark water. Sailors whispered in low tones, recounting stories of ships that had approached the island in years prior, only to vanish entirely. The guests, however, laughed off such tales, convinced that adventure awaited them, that the unknown was merely another indulgence to be conquered. As the flotilla approached the shore, the island revealed its first secret. Massive gates, carved from dark hardwood and inlaid with patterns that looked almost alive, stood as an entrance to a hidden settlement. Torches burned in sconces along stone pillars, their flames flickering against the morning mist. Figures, dressed in pale garments that contrasted sharply with the vibrant jungle, greeted the arrivals with polite bows. Their faces were carefully composed, smiles rehearsed, but there was a glint of something unreadable in their eyes. The guests stepped onto the sand, the warm grains sinking beneath polished boots and fine shoes, and were led through winding paths lined with flowers of impossible color, their petals shining as if dusted with gold. The settlement itself was a spectacle. Buildings rose from the jungle with elegant architecture reminiscent of the French countryside, yet infused with strange motifs, carvings of creatures, part human, part beast, fountains that sang with the sound of distant laughter. Music floated through the air, not from instruments the visitors could identify, but seemingly from the very walls, a melody both inviting and unsettling. Servants, equally pale and composed, guided the guests into the main hall, their hands gloved. their movements fluid, almost mechanical. The hall was vast, constructed of polished wood and crystal chandeliers that caught the sunlight in refracted rainbows. The long dining table gleamed, set with plates of the finest china, silver cutlery and crystal glasses. Candles burned even in the bright daylight, their flames unwavering. As the guests mingled, they were served wine that shimmered like liquid gold. Exotic fruits were passed, their skins glinting like gemstones, and small, intricately carved pastries that smelled of honey and spices. Conversations swirled around curiosity. How the hosts came to possess such wealth and knowledge of strange lands, what secrets the island held, and whether this banquet was truly for pleasure or something more. Madame Claudine Dupont, ever daring, leaned closer to Lord Blackwood and whispered, "Do you feel it? There is something beneath it all, a current we cannot see." He nodded but sipped his wine, the rich taste distracting him from unease he could not yet name. Outside the windows, the jungle seemed almost alive. Shadows moved where no trees should cast them, and the wind whispered in patterns that suggested language, though no one could understand it. A sense of expectation hung in the air, subtle yet pervasive, as if the island itself were aware of the visitors, evaluating their presence. Captain Thorne scribbled furiously in his journal, describing the flora, the architecture, the behavior of the hosts, trying to convince himself that it was all rational, an elaborate performance for the amusement of outsiders. Yet even he could not deny the growing tension, the feeling that the island was not. Merely a location, but a sentient entity, aware and waiting. As evening approached, the sky turned a deep, almost unnatural shade of violet, and lanterns along the paths flickered to life. Guests were led through corridors that twisted unpredictably, each turn revealing new wonders, gardens of luminescent flowers, fountains shaped like serpents, murals depicting events that could not have occurred. Some began to speculate in hushed tones about the origins of the hosts. Were they descendants of an isolated civilization, a family hidden from the world, or something stranger still? The island exuded a beauty and opulence, so overwhelming that fear was often disguised as fascination. Before the first dinner course, the hosts gathered everyone in the central hall. Their leader, a tall man with hair white as milk and eyes sharp and calculating, spoke in a voice smooth and commanding. He welcomed the guests with warmth, praising their courage and curiosity. "You have arrived at a place where the ordinary ceases to exist," he said. "Tonight you will dine not merely as observers, but as participants in a tradition that has endured beyond history itself. Expect wonders, for our island offers delights that cannot be found anywhere else in the world." His words, polished and eloquent, carried an undertone that made the guests uneasy, though they could not yet articulate why. As the banquet was announced, the servers moved with choreographed precision, carrying trays covered by silver domes. The guests leaned forward, anticipation and curiosity mingling with a faint, unnameable dread. Outside, the moon rose over the jungle canopy, casting silver light on the paths and shadows that seemed to watch the proceedings. The waves lapped gently at the shore, hiding the secrets of the island beneath their rhythmic pulse. The first hints of horror lay in wait, concealed behind the glamour, the music and the laughter, ready to reveal themselves when the moment was ripe. By the end of the first day, the guests retired to their rooms, luxurious, expansive quarters overlooking the sea. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by glimpses of shadowy figures at the edges of vision, the faintest hint of movement in the jungle, and the ever-present melody that drifted through the walls. Dreams were vivid and strange, visions of feasts, faces twisted in terror, the sea parting to reveal unseen horrors. When morning arrived, the sun rose over the glittering sands and dense foliage, casting light on an island that appeared serene and inviting once more. Yet beneath its beauty, the first threads of dread had taken root. Something was coming, something the guests had neither imagined nor anticipated. The morning sun had barely risen over the hidden island, casting a soft glow across the sands and dense jungle, yet the guests could not shake. The uneasy anticipation lingering from the previous evening, the memory of shadowed figures glimpsed at the edge of their rooms, the strange melody threading through the walls, and the unfamiliar scents in the hallways, had planted a seed of doubt that would not easily be uprooted. Breakfast was offered in the central hall, a simpler affair than the evening's expected feast. Yet even the pastries, golden and perfectly formed, seemed almost alive under the scrutiny of the eye. A few guests remarked upon the perfection of the fruit, how it glistened unnaturally, almost too radiant to be real. Captain Thorne, ever the rational observer, noted these details in his journal with meticulous care, yet the unease gnawed at him as it did the others. By midday, the island revealed another of its wonders. A series of gardens, winding paths, and glass-domed atriums filled with flora unknown to the civilized world. Plants twisted in impossible forms, colors luminous as jewels, petals that seemed to pulse under the sunlight. Birds with feathers of metallic sheen flitted among the branches, calling out in sharp, almost intelligent cries. The guests were led through the gardens by the pale hosts, whose smiles never wavered but whose eyes seemed to measure, each visitor with meticulous calculation. Some guests, notably Madame Dupont, whispered to Lord Blackwood that the place seemed aware, as if it could see them, anticipate their movements, and even respond in subtle, imperceptible ways. Blackwood merely nodded, gripping his cane a little tighter, unwilling to admit the shiver that ran down his spine. Lunch was served under a large, open pavilion at the center of the gardens, a structure of polished wood and glass that refracted sunlight into rainbows, dancing on the white stone floor. Dishes arrived in a steady procession, fish of glimmering silver scales, birds roasted to a delicate crisp, fruits dripping with juices that left vivid stains on the plates. The guests marveled at the flavors, exquisite beyond anything they had ever tasted. Conversation flowed, cautious but animated, until subtle inconsistencies began to surface. One of the guests, a young baron from Bordeaux, noticed the servants' uncanny precision. They moved with such synchronization it was almost robotic. Yet not mechanical, something else governed them, a strict discipline or perhaps something far darker. As the afternoon waned, whispers began to circulate. Captain Thorne, ever cautious, overheard a conversation between two servants, speaking in hushed tones that carried a rhythm oddly musical yet chilling. Words such as selection and preparation were repeated, yet no context was given. A small knot of unease began forming among the more perceptive guests. Madame Dupont, growing bold, slipped away from the others, wandering down a narrow, twisted corridor flanked by carved statues that seemed to watch her. At the end of the hallway, she glimpsed something that made her gasp. A shadowy figure, pale and small, shackled to a post, eyes wide with terror, and a faint whimper escaping its lips. The figure vanished behind the turn of the corridor as quickly as it appeared. Dupont returned to the main hall, her face pale, heart pounding, and whispered only to Blackwood, "It's not what they serve. It's them." The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of violet and crimson. As the main banquet was announced, the guests were led into a hall larger than any they had ever seen, its ceilings soaring, walls lined with carvings of fantastical creatures, and chandeliers that glimmered like captured sunlight. A long, polished table ran the length of the room, set with crystal, silver, and plates of the finest craftsmanship. Candles flickered along its length, their flames undiminished by the late afternoon light, casting dancing shadows that seemed to shift, independently of the objects around them. The air smelled rich, almost intoxicating, a mixture of roasting meats, tropical spices, and something metallic, faint yet unmistakable. When the first course arrived, served under polished silver domes, the guests leaned forward with curiosity and awe. The food was unlike anything they had ever seen. Textures delicate, colors vibrant, aromas rich and compelling. They hesitated only briefly before tasting, reassured by the host's confident smiles and the impeccable presentation. Lord Blackwood marveled at the flavor, noting in his journal, "A refinement I have never encountered. The taste transcends even the finest Parisian cuisine." But the sensation lingered with a subtle, unnameable wrongness, a bitterness that could not be placed on the tongue, yet spread through the mind like smoke. As the guests continued eating, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Some began noticing details that had previously escaped attention: the strange stiffness of the host's smiles, the synchronized movements of the servants, the faint sounds from the shadows at the edges of the room. Captain Thorne's meticulous gaze caught the flicker of panic in the eyes of a servant who seemed momentarily human, then quickly returned to calm, replaced by the practiced mask of hospitality. Madame Dupont, growing increasingly horrified, tried to speak to other guests, to warn them, but disbelief and denial kept most occupied with the spectacle of the feast. Curiosity, pride, and fear mingled into an intoxicating cocktail, trapping them in a web woven before they even knew they were ensnared. By the second course, subtle revelations began to emerge. The silver domes lifted to reveal dishes that resembled human forms, yet crafted with artistry so precise it took moments for some to comprehend. Fingers of roasted flesh, limbs shaped with uncanny accuracy, and faces molded in perfect detail lay before the guests. Gasps erupted, yet confusion quickly followed. Some assumed an elaborate illusion, a culinary artistry beyond modern comprehension. Others felt a creeping dread, a gnawing certainty that their senses were betraying them. Madame Dupont's face turned ashen as she noticed the small signs of life, the faintest movement in an eye, a twitch of muscle, a silent, desperate pleading that chilled the room's air. Panic began to ripple through the hall. Lord Blackwood slammed his hand against the table, knocking over a goblet, his voice trembling. This cannot be." Others looked to the hosts for explanation, but the pale leader of the banquet raised a single hand, and the room fell silent. His eyes, sharp and gleaming with an unyielding calm, swept over the guests. "You have come seeking marvels, have you not?" he asked, his tone smooth yet carrying a weight of inevitability. "Marvels are before you. All that you see is the result of centuries of careful cultivation, patience, and selection. Fear is natural, but your curiosity brought you here. You are part of the tradition now." At that moment, the island itself seemed to shift, the walls of the hall elongating, shadows twisting into forms that hinted at shapes and faces not entirely human. The music that had once been charming now reverberated with discord, filling the space with an almost sentient presence. Guests attempted to flee, only to find the hall far larger than it had appeared moments before. Corridors leading back into the central space, exits blocked by the hosts who moved with a precision and speed that defied reason. Whispers of terror spread as some tried to hide, crouching behind columns or beneath the long table. The metallic scent of blood now mingled with the spices in the air, sharp and undeniable, sending even the most rational minds into panic. Captain Thorne, clutching his journal and desperately trying to rationalize, muttered to himself about mass hallucinations, fevered imagination, or some elaborate deception. But the subtle movements in the corners of the room, the suppressed cries from behind screens, and the deliberate calm of the hosts spoke louder than any argument. The horror became undeniable. The feast was not merely a spectacle of culinary artistry, it was a ritual, and the guests had walked directly into the heart of it. The remainder of the evening blurred into chaos. Some guests were dragged from their hiding places, their screams muffled by hands that were firm yet eerily gentle. Others collapsed in terror, eyes wide, unable to comprehend what they were seeing there. Minds teetering on the edge of madness. Madame Dupont, clutching Blackwood's arm, tried to reason with the hosts, demanding explanations, yet received only the same unnerving calm. The leader's voice, soft yet authoritative, echoed across the hall. All who seek the extraordinary must understand its cost. You are witnessing what few have ever survived to describe. By nightfall, the hall fell into an unnatural quiet. The surviving guests, those who had managed to hide or feign compliance, were left with only fragments of understanding. The air seemed to hum with the presence of the unseen, the shadows now carrying a weight of memory and ritual. Captain Thorne, scribbling feverishly in his journal, wrote of the impossible, a civilization devoted to an unspeakable tradition, sustained by secrecy, deception, and the ultimate indulgence of its hosts. The guests understood with horrifying clarity that the island's hospitality was a facade masking an ancient and inhuman appetite. As the night deepened, the moon rose above the jungle canopy, casting silver light across the scene of devastation. The surviving guests, pale and shaken, huddled together, realizing that the island had not yet finished with them. Outside, the waves lapped gently at the shore, hiding the darkness beneath. The secrets of a place that existed beyond maps and reason, waiting patiently for the next set of curious souls to arrive. The banquet had revealed its true nature, and the island had claimed its place in their memories forever, not as a paradise, but as a place of exquisite terror. Night did not fall on the island the way it did elsewhere. Darkness seemed to rise from the ground itself, seeping into corridors, curling around pillars, swallowing light rather than merely dimming it. The survivors, those few guests who had not been taken during the banquet, found themselves herded into a section of the settlement that felt deliberately isolated. The halls here were narrower, the walls closer, the air heavier. Every footstep echoed too loudly, as if the island wanted them to remember that they were still being watched. No chains bound them, no guards stood openly nearby, yet none attempted escape. Fear had replaced restraint. Captain Elias Thorne counted 12 survivors. 12 out of more than 40 who had arrived only days before with laughter, wine and arrogance. Lord Blackwood sat against the wall, his fine coat torn, hands trembling uncontrollably. Madame Claudine Dupont remained upright, her back straight despite exhaustion, her eyes sharp with a mixture of fury and resolve. Others stared blankly ahead, their minds fractured by what they had witnessed. The silence between them was thick, broken only by distant sounds, doors closing, footsteps passing, and the faint, rhythmic music that never truly stopped. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had lost its meaning. Eventually, a servant arrived, not with force, but with calm politeness. He informed them that they would be rested and cared for, as honored guests still under the island's protection. The words felt obscene. Food was brought untouched by most. Water was accepted, though suspicion lingered. Captain Thorne noticed something unsettling. The servant avoided eye contact entirely, as if ashamed or afraid. When Thorne quietly asked where the others had been taken, the servant hesitated, then whispered, "The island chooses," before leaving. Sleep came reluctantly. When it did, it was filled with fractured dreams, endless tables, smiling faces, doors that led nowhere, the ocean closing in from all sides. Madame Dupont awoke before dawn, heart racing, certain she had heard a voice calling her name. She rose silently and moved to the narrow window overlooking the jungle. What she saw confirmed her worst fear. Paths that had existed the day before were gone, replaced by dense foliage. Buildings had shifted. The island was changing itself. Escape, she realized, was not merely difficult. It was being actively prevented. By morning, Captain Thorne had reached the same conclusion. Comparing notes with Madame Dupont, He confirmed that corridors no longer aligned. Staircases led to unfamiliar levels, and windows that once faced the sea now revealed only stone walls. The island was not static. It responded. It adapted. Whether by design or something more unsettling, it seemed to understand intention. When guests thought of escape, routes vanished. When they lingered in fear, doors appeared. The island itself had become their jailer. The hosts returned that afternoon. Their leader, the pale man with the unreadable eyes, addressed the survivors. With unsettling serenity, he spoke of balance, of preservation, of a society that had survived centuries by remaining unseen and uncompromising. Outsiders, he explained, were never invited lightly. Those who arrived had already been chosen long before the letters were sent. "The world beyond our shores takes without consequence," he said calmly. Here, consequence is tradition. No argument moved him. No plea softened his expression. To him, this was not cruelty, it was order. Yet arrogance breeds oversight. That night, during a rare storm that battered the coastline with violent winds, the island's perfect rhythm faltered. Lanterns flickered. Music stuttered into silence. The survivors felt it immediately. The oppressive awareness eased, if only slightly. Captain Thorne seized the moment. Using a fragment of metal hidden since the banquet, he forced open a narrow service door he had memorized days earlier. Madame Dupont gathered the others, urgency replacing despair. For the first time since arrival, the island did not seem to anticipate their movement. They ran, through rain-soaked corridors, down shifting steps, across courtyards where statues seemed to turn away in disappointment. 2 survivors were lost when the ground beneath them collapsed into darkness. The island reclaiming what it could. The remaining 10 reached the shoreline just as dawn threatened the horizon. A small supply vessel, likely meant for internal transport, rocked violently against the dock. With no time to hesitate, they boarded and cut the line. The sea resisted them fiercely, waves striking as if summoned. But desperation fueled strength. As the island receded into mist, its shape seemed to blur, as though unwilling to be remembered accurately. By the time the sun fully rose, there was nothing behind them but open water. No jungle, no towers, no shore, only silence. Rescue came days later. When the survivors were found, half-starved and delirious, their story was dismissed as shared madness. Newspapers called it hysteria. Officials blamed spoiled food, fever, or mass hallucination. Captain Thorne's journal vanished into a private archive, labeled unreliable account. Madame Dupont withdrew from society entirely, refusing interviews, refusing explanations. Lord Blackwood never spoke of the journey again. Yet some nights, sailors still report music drifting across calm seas. Maps occasionally show a faint outline where no land should exist, only to correct themselves by morning. Invitations, embossed in gold, sealed with unfamiliar wax, are still rumored to arrive in select households, promising wonder beyond imagination. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the island waits, patient, observant, unforgiving.